our intention will be to share it with our membership. So thanks again, everyone. For those who may not have been so directly involved as many of our presenters today, Cyclone Yasa was probably one of the strongest cyclones in the Pacific since Winston in 2016, and it's probably one of the fourth most intense cyclone on record in the Pacific Basin. When Cyclone Yasa made landfall in Vanuatu on the 17th of December, the winds were calculated at 350 kilometers per hour, and a hurricane warning was put in force for the entire country. State of emergency was declared just before Christmas, which is never good, and a curfew was put in place affecting the entire country. At the time, the National Disaster Management Office said that at least 600,000 people were in Yasa's path. Sadly, the cyclone resulted in 4 deaths, and at Christmas time, about 6,500 people remained in evacuation centres around the country. New Zealand NGOs were an important part of the response to this, and in partnership with local agencies on the ground, continue to support the response and ongoing recovery. New Zealand government is also a vital part of our response, and initially provided $2 million in assistance to Fiji in response to Cyclone Yasa. Of approximately 800,000 of this was provided to New Zealand NGOs to respond through their local partners. And we're lucky enough to have representatives from MFAT, Richie Hanna, with us today. And Richie, by all means, feel free to correct me later on, if you like. As Fiji continues to deal with the impact of COVID-19, traditional response mechanisms have included some new challenges, and we hope to hear from our NGO colleagues today about what some of those are. Just by way of introduction, from Anglican Mission, we've got Steph Fry. From Caritas Aotearoa, we've got Phil Brass, and from Habitat for Humanity, we've got Jamila Homonya. So we'll kick off, and I wonder if Phil from Caritas, if you'd like to share with us what Caritas Aotearoa has been doing, and what you're up to now, and some of your thoughts on the response.
Sure, thanks, Aaron. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, no, it's been a pretty crazy time get this together, and I guess. Well, Aaron, can I share my screen? I've got just a couple of wee shots. I want to. Sorry, Aaron, you're on mute, I think. Thank you.
Oh, great. Yep, Phil, you should be able to share your screen. Fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for that. Good as gold. Okay. So yes, now I need to point out too, it wasn't just me putting this together. Rachel Harrison, also here at Caritas, also gave up of her time between Christmas and New Year's, and subsequently with some reviews to get this off the ground. Look, I just start with the first shot here. I just wanted to, I picked the shot because this is, many of you will be familiar with the Cessna Caravan, used a lot through the islands. This is taken just looking down, about to come into land on Taverny Island in Fiji. To use this shot just to remind me and to remind us of what we used to do in between writing proposals and progress reports. And I know I'm not the only one here today who is missing the face-to-face time with partners and communities that we work with. But looking at the response that we were able to put together, we've been quite blessed here with quite a long-term partner in Tutu Rural Training Centre in Taverny Island in Fiji, which is in the Northern Division, a wee way from where the Cyclone Yasa made landfall. But all the same, quite involved in that whole district with communities and villages around agriculture, food security, and sort of village level training and workshops through their quite large current and recent student body of agricultural students. The image here I nicked from a Radio New Zealand article that was sent to me. Trajectory quite well, if not quite simply. If you look at the top left-hand side there, top right-hand side, sorry, Taverny Island, it's a bit hard to see there, just off to the east of Vanuatu, Tutu Rural Training Centre. Now it's based on Taverny. While it wasn't in close direct path of TC Yasa, was close enough to sustain extensive damage, primarily from rainfall. Now, Caritas Aotearoa New Zealand has been a key partner with Tutu, and it's located on about 1,200 acres of fertile soil on the steep slopes, Mount Galao on the western side of Taverny Island. But Tutu's been in constant operation for about 40 years, providing non-formal agricultural and livelihoods training, and mentoring and community-based workshops across rural villages and communities across the Northern Division. So that's a lot of people, 40 years of mahi, doing much, not the same, but similar sort of programs over those 4 decades. What I mentioned with been partners of Tutu for some time, most recently at the tail end of a 3-year pivot. That also concluded quite a lot of disaster and climate preparedness measures, particularly the pivot kicked off just at the tail end of Cyclone Winston. So a lot of the learnings from Winston, particularly around infrastructure, buildings and so forth, and housing of seeds and seedlings. And we directed a lot of the program initially towards securing the property so it can get back on track fairly quickly. And that's a lot of the thrust of this this current work that we're looking to do there. So Tutu's main goal is to support rural communities in Fiji through people-centered development. It's a nice term. What does it mean in actuality? For Tutu staff and management, that's really training and mentoring through agriculture, livelihoods, capacity and confidence building. So while agriculture, particularly and agricultural-based livelihoods, is an important aspect of what they do day to day, their underlying DNA is to support rural communities in Fiji to remain vibrant and sustainable for young people, particularly to avoid the lure of the city or other countries or into resort work, particularly for young females. So Tutu's oriented its programs quite clearly to support the vibrancy of rural communities. So there's four key programs that Tutu runs. And these images here just show some of the reasonably recent images of the sort of work they do. Probably the biggest program is a young male farmer, 3-year full-time agricultural training. And then there's a village extension mentoring workshop program. Then they run a young farming couples agricultural and rural livelihoods training. And then look at the top right-hand side is single women's livelihoods training. That's a fairly new program that kicked off only a year or two ago. So while in practice, all these different programs have some part to play in the DRP activity. The first two, it's the young male farmers agricultural training and the village extension mentoring and workshops, were found to be especially suited to delivering a meaningful response to communities who have lost crops, food and nutritional security as a result of Cyclone Yasa in December. So with the first, the Young Male Farmers Program, that runs on what's called an oscillation cycle, 5 weeks. The students will spend 5 weeks on Tutu. There's currently 52 current students. They'll spend five weeks at Tutu on the property in Taverny Island, and then 5 weeks back at the home village, connecting with the families and practicing what they've learned up at Tutu on the property. The visitation or the extension village work really involves senior Tutu staff visiting the student and their family and spending time with village, particular village leadership structures and so forth, to make sure that what they're doing is also socially proving a positive force for the village, particularly around land access, where they're generally using customary land. The land is not titled or owned by any particular family. So there's often a lot of discussion around access to that land. So combined, these two programs will be used to activate the rather extensive network of students as a functional agricultural network that extends to the hardest hit areas of Bua and Makuata, but also up into much other parts of Vanuatu that were quite affected by the cyclone. Just on to the last slide here. So with this activity, Tutu RTC will essentially provide necessary inputs of seeds and plant material, agricultural knowledge and labour via the student networks to assist the rejuvenation of firstly nutritional crops and gardens, and secondly cash and livelihoods crops, all on customary land at each participating village. Before this can happen, Tutu will need significant repairs to its own property to be able to help the students or help their networks to help the villages they're connected with. Tutu itself needs to get back up to speed. So a good chunk of the DRP funding will go towards rehabilitating the Tutu's many dirt roads. There's approximately 8 kilometres that need work. The rain was significant and there's a lot of slips. And it's the bottom left-hand corner, you see a little image there. That's one of the Land Cruisers we use up there, and that's a typical access road. And this was taken sort of, you know, a fairly dry spell, and it was quite passable. But at the moment, those roads are totally unusable. It's a very steep property, and without these roads, the students and staff have lost access to a lot of the property to be able to do replanting and reseeding of necessary seeds and vegetables and other traditional crops. Also, we were building approximately 600 square metres of shade gardens for the raising of seeds and darrow tops. Currently, there's around 55,000 Yangona, that's cassava and darrow plants on site. As I said, a lot of these can't be accessed easily or safely, and which is paramount, of course, that they're able to get up to their plots safely. So the Tutu response will be divided into 2 main components: the rapid rejuvenation of the property, the student networks to support participant communities across the Northern Division. So while the really technical and a lot of equipment involved and road infrastructure, the second component, which is quite cheap, will leverage Tutu's extensive social leaders, farming families, and ties with the likes of the PIFON, the Pacific Island Farmers Organisation, but also the Ministry of Agriculture, the Northern Division, which they have very close ties with. So all these things were brought into the equation to try and facilitate an efficient delivery of rapid agricultural support. So that's really what I want to present and what we're going to be doing. But really, I just want to, from the Tutu whānau and all of us here at Caritas, special thanks to MFAT for their assistance with this program, and you know, a shout out to Richie particularly, who was very, his feedback and guidance through the proposal process was really appreciated. Both myself and Rachel, it's the first time doing a DRP proposal. I've worked with Tutu for many years personally, so I know how they operate, and they operate very well. But I do appreciate their help through this proposal process. And cheers, everybody, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, Phil. That was really interesting, and a really good reminder to us that there's some really important links between maintaining infrastructure to protect livelihoods as well following an emergency. So I'll get you to stop sharing your screen, and we'll get Jamila from Habitat for Humanity, I should say, to share with us what you've been up to with your team as well, Jamila.
Thanks, Aaron. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us on to have a chat. Yeah, we work with Habitat for Humanity Fiji, who we've worked with for a very long time. And we also work regionally with them as part of our Habitat Pacific Task Force, which includes our Asia Pacific office and our Australia office. And we try to make sure our approach and our responses in the Pacific to disaster are all coordinated. So when TC Yasa struck, we were working through our PTF structure to see how we would approach the disaster. Just a second, Aaron, sorry.
It's all right. Probably a good time for everyone to go have a cup of tea, or not.
Sorry about that. So we worked together. Unfortunately, our Australia had the AHP process, which I think had them working over Christmas, and poor things. So we made sure that we were looking at an approach that would reduce, I think, the stress and impact on Habitat Fiji, who I think went, at the moment, are counting up about 5 different funders that they are working with to respond to TC Yasa, which I think is really overwhelming. So through the Habitat Network, we try as much as we can to coordinate and reduce that impact on Habitat Fiji. A few years back, we sort of, Habitat looked at how do we respond best to disasters in the Pacific and what's the best approach that we can take. We noticed that increasingly shelter kits were flooding the countries in the weeks following a disaster, and that maybe that wasn't the best use of Habitat, seeing as we did have much more expertise in that sort of early, medium and long-term recovery, and that actual repairs to housing was something that not many NGOs were going into, often none, or we would be the only one in a country sort of staying there up to 12 months or long work. So we sort of made a bit of a shift then away from shelter kits and dropping those on the ground in the few weeks following a disaster, moving more towards working with communities on Build Back Safer awareness training and simple repair projects where we're doing a little bit of repairs, but what we're actually doing is building the capacity of the communities on the ground to repair themselves and actually start to think about what they can be doing to make their structures stronger for the next cyclone. So trying to build that resilience. So that's a bit of a shift that Habitat's had, and it fits in really well with our approach to disaster response, which is pathways to permanence. So Habitat respond to disasters with an approach that is thinking of every intervention that we do is about long-term development. It's about leading people on a pathway that gets them into a safe, durable, long-term shelter. So trying to think about any interventions that we might introduce, are these actually going to be contributing to that or not? And is there another way that we can do an intervention that will be contributing to that end game for those communities or households we're working with? So that's the Habitat approach that we try to take when we're developing a response program. So working with Habitat, came up with a program for Yasa, which is starting out with our assessments, going house to house and looking exactly what types of repairs households need. We've COVID very in the fronts of our minds for that, because we're not only doing repairs to wash repairs where needed. And so included in those assessments is hygiene messaging and just making sure that that's sort of always integrated into the way that we work in disaster response and our development programming now in the Pacific. So after the assessments, we'll then move into our repair program, which has minor and major categories for repair work. And we've got numbers there, just over 60 with the minor repairs and 20 with the major repairs. But we're really mindful that from most disasters that we've responded to, those can move around a little bit, and we're really flexible in working with our partners and also with MFAT to say that the time periods as they move along post-disaster and the assessments are never 100%, and it is always the actuals on the ground that come into play. Sorry about that. Yes, and then we've got our BBS training, which is Build Back Safer training, which we'll be looking at around 80 participants for that. And we've modified our Build Back Safer training to include some really basic wash plumbing training in there, so that not only are we giving those skills into the community around how to build your shelters more resilient, but really having that holistic view of shelter, which includes wash as well. So making sure that they've got some of those basic in there within the training at the same time. So that's sort of in a nutshell what we'll be doing, and we'll be spreading that over the full sort of 12-month period. So it's very in keeping with the approach that we took to TC Gita in Tonga and to Harold in Fiji earlier last year. So we're sort of really tending to focus more on sort of a type of repair package that includes training along the way. And I think what we see in Fiji is probably an even more stronger push of bringing in the WASH skills as well, which is really, I think, paying attention to what we're seeing with COVID as well and future pandemics, just trying to sort of be very focused on how we mitigate for not only disasters and climate change, but now also pandemics too. So yeah, that's probably just an overarching overview of how Habitat will approach TC Yasa response.
Thanks, Jamila, and really pertinent that you mentioned COVID. I was really interested from your perspective. You know, there's been a lot of talk about how COVID restrictions have limited work, well, have supposedly limited how NGOs might work in the Pacific. From your experience, has it been disruptive, or have you had to change some of the ways that you work, or have you sort of quite successfully found a way around that to keep everything running smoothly?
Yeah, definitely we've had to adjust how we work. We do have a lot of community programming, so when we've had different restrictions in different countries around groups gathering and things like that, we've had to adjust how we approach all of those to fit in. But you know, that hasn't been us, that's been our local partners. They've worked really closely with government to see how do we adjust, how do we still deliver the ethos of what we want to deliver, but around these requirements. And from our perspective, we've been tried to be as supportive as we can of our local partners, saying we don't want you to be putting any of your staff at risk, so making sure that the funding's there for all the appropriate measures. So if it means that we're going to take longer to do an output because we're going to deliver it in a slightly different way, we just make sure that we're looking at that and re-examining it and working with MFAT on that so that we can do it in an appropriate manner. So I think there's always ways around it to solve it. But yeah, it definitely comes up, and I think we haven't seen in the countries that we work in, and Samoa, Fiji, Tonga, like, you know, a full-blown COVID pandemic. So it's been more working around those restrictions, and in Fiji, obviously, around the risks to the team. But I think what we have been thinking about more, and this is probably as we move into things as well, is the impacts that COVID and those lockdown of those countries has meant for them, and then the implications for your programming, and then how can we adjust our programming or make it more responsive or inclusive, or even things that we are doing that we now realize actually there's even more importance around that now. Like we do full carpentry vocational training in Fiji, and with the decrease in the tourism market, actually reskilling and retraining is even more important than it was before. So yeah, maybe it's made some parts of the program even more important.
Yeah, that makes sense, and we often have to remind ourselves that the nature of our work is that we're always working with things that are disruptive anyways. So yeah, whether it's a cyclone or a pandemic, we'll be trying to find a way around it. Thanks, Jamila. That was really interesting. Steph, I'd like to invite Steph from for Anglican Mission to share with us what you've been doing with the Yasa response as well.
Thanks, Aaron. Kia ora team, just wanted to introduce Campbell here, my colleague. He's our new development officer here in the commissions. Also wanted to address Jamila and just say that we had a team go out to a quite small remote village, and the only house that was left standing was one that was built by Habitat. So just reiterating the amazing work that they do. So our response, we obviously teamed up with Tier Fund, as well as utilised our partner equivalents in Australia for our funding. So we work through the Anglican Diocese in Polynesia. I guess in a sense they're our partners, but we more consider them to be colleagues. So the structure that we work through the Anglican Church is that we have the MAS, which is based in Suva, and that's the head office, and that's where we have accommodation and where all the offices are. And then we also have our churches scattered around, as well as from there we'll also have more smaller worship centres. So these are often very small buildings, very small rooms, or sometimes they're even part of somebody's own house. So before I got into it, I'm just going to share with you all a map of the we work through our different churches and worship centres. Just bear with me. I'll show all windows. I've just got far too many windows open. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes, yeah, we can see it, Steph, thanks.
So here you'll see, so we've got in our green spots, these are our main churches. Some of them are hidden behind our windows, which are the ones shown in purple, as well as we've got 3 schools. So we've got St. Paul's down here, and then we've got a couple more up here. So not all the worship centres are shown because some are in very remote locations. I know there's a couple in this forestry area here that I couldn't quite map. So just picked what we were working with and trying to address all our teams, as well as make sure we were doing it in a kind of fair and equitable manner throughout those communities. Now I'm just going to jump on and share our PowerPoint. I'll jump up to the beginning. Here we go. So just that map. So our response was kind of structured through 3 areas. The immediate needs that our team identified for our initial assessment, along with what the NGO required, as well as slotting into areas that the government had overlooked, particularly around their initial food rations. So as the map showed, we have a lot of worship centres that are very remote, they're very hard to get to, and often due to the limited people living in that area, it can be quite struggle to make it worth it. So that's how we kind of slotted in. Lots of these areas are only accessible through our 4x4 we have on Vanalevu, as well as through our boat that we use. A lot of them can only be accessed via the river. So our immediate needs were seen as food rations to supplement those given by the government, as well as when the government ones slowly run out, where we can slot in and fill that need, as well as around school equipment. So we had reports of children from some of our communities selling personal items in order to be able to afford equipment for schools. So we structured our food parcels to cover the 8 to 12 week period that it would take for our newly planted crops to be established and food security to be restored. So we made the parcels each last about 4 weeks just to make sure the logistical component was not too costly, as well as ensuring that they kind of complemented the nutrition requirements of the communities and the crops that they had already harvested. One thing we did note was that we wanted to make these food rations really flexible and acknowledge that it's not a one size fits all for some of our communities, and some needed none and some needed a lot more. I'm sure you're all aware currently there's quite a bit of flooding in Vanalevu with the recent pressure movement. So we've already had reports of some of newly planted crops already being destroyed. So that again will affect our food ration component. So our longer term response that we are currently initiating at the moment is kind of addressing this food security by increasing our community tool and seedling banks, along with trainings around innovative agriculture, space utilisation and soil management. So these workshops have been shaped from the needs that the community has already identified. So we actually had requests around a food security project come in before TC Yasa. So this really allowed us to bring in that project to what we're already carrying out. And that's pretty good. So we're planning on building on, you know, Indigenous garden practices that are in place and actually seeing how we can complement those through different methods, particularly around the space utilisation. So our next response is around water security and management. So this was one big need that we identified in our communities. And lots of them did have different requirements, and we needed to acknowledge the whole one size does not fit all in this space. So it was just simple things like new water tanks being repaired, new guttering water catchment systems, and then others, it was more complicated, such as pumps and gravity-fed irrigation systems. So through our response on our water security, we're also focusing on building up water management committees to kind of allow for that local ownership, and also working into the project designing to make sure it works for those communities. So again, we tapped into another project we already had operating throughout Fiji, which was our Water for All. So we kind of use our water experts through there to manage the subcomponent of our response. Lastly, there was significant reports of stress from kind of the compilation of TC Herald, COVID, and now Yasa, resulting in increased tension within the family unit. The idea was around our water security and food security projects to be structured as community ownership and kind of counteract the reports of hopelessness that we were hearing from these communities. And we were also going to build on this further down psychosocial and prevention support through group workshops and one-on-one mentoring. So away from all the positive stuff, now to more the challenges. So we acknowledge that with localization, our response was changed, as we could not see, we did not have the team, we couldn't jump over there. So it was our kind of opportunity to be more dynamic in how we respond. So a lot of our pre-cyclone season preparation, instead of being so focused on pre-position supplies and that side of things, we did a bit more of an investment into building our own human capacity and utilizing what we already had over there, as well as building on our supply chains that we'd established in our COVID response. So we wanted to make sure we had all of those communication and logistical supply chains in place so we could tap into them as soon as was required. And this was a change that was forced due to COVID. So it also made us leverage the resources we had available and also use them more effectively, in all honesty, such as our SEVA program. So you'll see up on screen some of our SEVA team. So SEVA stands for Community Integrated Vulnerability Analysis, and it's a GIS application that young people throughout Fiji and Tonga are trained in. So it's recognised by USP, and it uses GIS systems to map out and identify vulnerable people and infrastructure, as well as skilled personnel and resources. So as soon as we had reports of TC Yasa, our team out in the communities to identify vulnerable individuals and help them prepare. So here we have the team boarding up some houses, and the next one, they're strapping down some roofs. So this really benefited us to have built capacity in the space, because as soon as the cyclone hit, we also had the team going back out. So we had them going back to those identified vulnerable areas, those identified vulnerable people, and then assisting them in ways they could. This information that when our needs assessment team went over from Suva, they already had all that information available for them and knew where they needed to check up on it and where they needed to go. And it also allowed us to immediately then pass this through our representative to the NDMO. So one of the other kind of negative sides of COVID was that we actually had a lot more vulnerable people who the needs we had to meet. So a lot of them traditionally would have been based in Suva or in the resorts, but now they were home. So that actually kind of increased not just the cost of the project overall, but also how complicated it was, as we had a different dynamic of personnel to work with. So we actually found this to be a positive, quite a bit of areas, as we actually had many innovative and forward-thinking young members of the community home. And a lot of them had that enthusiasm and determination, local capabilities of these small communities. So it was a lot more locally driven. There was a lot more enthusiasm to grow this resilience. So we tapped in through our community gardens and tool bank response, as well as tapping into it through, as we go forward, our agricultural training, as well as our establishment of water management communities. So we're really wanting to tap into these groups of young people, utilise their skills, utilise their innovation, actually give them a level of ownership and investment in their own home communities. Another thing that really came forward was to utilise all our other projects. So not just, this isn't just a response on its own, it's a response, but what other projects can we move in, like moving in our water for all. And we also wanted to move in our COVID project. So we could utilise the same food parcel supply chains that we used within our COVID response. So here you'll see a picture. So we've got RJ Patel here with Archbishop Karma. So we struck up a deal with them that we kind of duplicated from our COVID response for reduced cost of food, as well as food vouchers as was appropriate. And then it's very easy to set up a system of these are the food that you can buy with this voucher and so on. And then we also use the community tool banks that we'd already had in place. So this allowed for a lot more of the gardens to be cleared a lot quicker, as well as period. And we also had church land and compounds available for all community to use, so that those with little or no food could grow food back straight away. This was an initiative that was set up in our COVID response, and we were just able to kind of not so much duplicate it, but build on that awareness of this land is available, this is the tools we have for you to use it, and so on. Also, one benefit from our COVID response we didn't actually think of until it happened was the fact that we had already established supply chains to address the need, chainsaws of certain communities. So we actually had community members out straight away being able to use these chainsaws to actually clear roads to make it a lot easier for people to reach them. Just touching on a few more of our challenges. So in Fiji, our partners, COVID wasn't at the forefront of their minds. So I was also having to sit down and be like, hey, just because it doesn't seem like the biggest issue at the moment, we still need to abide by all the precautions as necessary. Another challenge, particularly for the church context, was there is an expectation that all our church communities, that the priest and pastor had the ability to fix all the needs of the community. So there was a lot of expectations put on them, a lot of pressure, and also a lot of people coming to ask for help. So those were some of our main challenges. One last one I'll just touch on, which wasn't so much in Fiji itself, but was actually in our Pacific communities here, was, I'm sure this will probably get everyone slightly agitated, but we had a lot of people wanting to send goods over. We had a lot of churches saying, oh, we've got a whole haul full of goods, like we want to send it over to our families. So that's where the Donate Responsibly resource actually came in very handy. So I just want to do a little thank you for that, especially Aaron. So we were able to use that, use it as a resource, because sometimes us ourselves struggle to articulate it, but having that resource there is pretty awesome. And also kind of suggesting ideas like sell your goods, you've got Marketplace, you've got Trade Me, and then use the money to help as well. So that's about that from our end. Any questions?
Thanks, Steph. Yeah, if anyone does have any questions for Steph, let us know or put it in the chat. And yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Steph. The Donate Responsibly issue, or the around unsolicited goods being donated to the Pacific following an emergency, is probably a whole nother discussion as well. So thanks for that. Certainly, a lot of the NGO work couldn't be done without public support and the support of churches. but also Ministry of Foreign Affairs is a huge support as well. So I'd like to hand over to Richie to share with us some of the perspectives from the government angle. Thanks, Richie.
Kia ora koutou, and Aaron and Sid for the opportunity to speak today. Also, I'd like to say thanks and acknowledge Phil, Jamila and Steph for the presented. I think gives a really nice flavour of the types of support that can be mobilised through New Zealand NGOs and Pacific disaster response. So really appreciate that. Very quickly, just by brief introduction, I'm in the Ministry's Humanitarian and Disaster Management team. So we're kind of responsible within MFAT for our offshore disaster responses. And Aaron's given me a few different topics to touch on today. One is to explain how we make a decision on whether to respond when there is an event in the Pacific. The second one is to provide an overview of what we've done and through what mechanisms for the TC Yasa response in Fiji. Then we'll talk a little bit more specifically about how we work with NGOs, both New Zealand NGOs, and also touching briefly on working directly with local NGOs in Fiji in this instance. And lastly, some of the current challenges associated with some of which have already been touched on by the other presenters today. So I guess starting back at the beginning, how does MFAT make a decision on whether to respond? We have two key triggers that we look for before we mobilise a response. Number one is to look for a spike in humanitarian need. So this would, in the Pacific context, normally be following a natural disaster, but you can imagine outside of the Pacific, we will also be looking for more conflict-related spikes in humanitarian need. And the second point that we are looking for is a request for assistance from New Zealand, which comes from the affected government, or in some instances, it might be an acceptance of an offer of assistance that we make proactively, normally through the relevant High Commission in the affected country. And that second part there is, I think, a key becoming more and more important. In our humanitarian action policy, it's very clear that we are looking to support locally led responses in the Pacific. So we don't want to get too far out in front of the affected. We recognise their sovereignty and also their ability to lead their own response. So we'll be very much looking to align behind locally led response plans. And I'll come back to that later in the discussion as well. Moving specifically to look at the TC Yasa response and the different aspects that comprised our overall package of assistance to Fiji. In total, we have mobilised about 2.5 million New Zealand dollars worth of humanitarian assistance. We did this over two packages. The first one, which was announced on the 18th, very promptly after the cyclone impacted, included support with aerial surveillance. So this involved the use of New Zealand asset flights over the affected areas in Fiji, and to take a whole host of aerial photography, which was then shared with the government of Fiji to give them an idea of the scale of the damage in affected areas. Also in that initial package of support, we released or authorised the release of some emergency relief kits that we have already pre-positioned in Fiji. This is through one of our implementing partners, Rotary. So those kits were very rapidly made available to go out to affected populations in Fiji. And we also made some funding available to the New Zealand High Commission in Suva, and that allowed them to respond promptly and flexibly to needs on the ground as they arose. And then a few days later, on the 22nd of December, we had a second package of assistance. That included what Aaron has already mentioned at the beginning, which is a round of funding for non-government NGOs, non-government organisations and their local partners through the New Zealand Disaster Response Partnership, and I'll touch a little bit more on that later. That was to the value of $750,000 initially, although we did bump it up, which allowed us to fully fund 4 of the proposals. We also made contributions to the government of Fiji. So they set up a dedicated relief and fund, which we contributed to, and that allowed the government of Fiji to mobilise its own assistance for affected populations. And we made a contribution to the International Federation of the Red Cross to support the Fiji Red Cross. And many of you will know that often the Red Cross will be one of the key sort of response actors in disasters, both in the Pacific and also elsewhere. We provided a number of relief supplies also from New Zealand to complement those that we already had in country through Rotary. So these relief supplies we keep in Auckland, and they're available to go anywhere in the Pacific, which is impacted by a disaster. In this case, the type of items that we sent included shelter kits, agriculture toolkits, generators, chainsaws, tarpaulins, mother and infant kits, hygiene kits, and water containers. And the supplies were actually delivered to Fiji via Fiji Airways, who had brought, I think, 2 of their planes out to Auckland to shelter from the cyclone as it passed over. And then when these planes were returning to Fiji, they were empty, of course, but we were able to put some relief supplies on them. So that worked out well for everyone, I think. And also, lastly, in that second package, we made a little bit more funding available to our High Commission to allow them to continue to respond to needs as they were emerging on the ground in Fiji. So going a little bit deeper into how we work with NGOs in disaster response, I think the first thing I would like to say is that we very much view NGOs as a key sort of component of our overall disaster response, and really value what New Zealand NGOs and their local partners in the Pacific can bring to disaster response, both in terms of things like sort of technical skills, but also that proximity to affected communities and an ability to work closely with communities is really valued from our side. Our primary mechanism, and I appreciate some of you on the call will know this very well, but for those who don't, our primary mechanism of NGOs is a disaster response partnership. So this is a group of New Zealand NGOs that have been accredited with us. That means they've gone through a number of checks on capabilities. So we want to have confidence that the organisations that we're working with have the necessary competencies to do a good job. This is both in the sort of humanitarian response area, but also more broadly in terms of things like financial controls, project management, and that type of thing, because we want to make sure that we're using taxpayer funds appropriately, of course. And so we have at the moment 14 New Zealand NGOs accredited as New Zealand Disaster Response Partnership members. And basically what happens is whenever there is a disaster, in this case in the Pacific, we will consider whether support through NGOs makes sense. And if it does, we would look to launch what's called a funding round for the NZDR. Normally it will have a specific funding envelope attached to it. And we'll send a call for proposals out to all of the NZTRP members with some parameters Pacific response. And then NZDRP members have a set amount of time to consider what they'd like to do in terms of support to the affected country. They come back to us with quite a detailed proposal, stepping through what they're proposing to do, what the sort of outputs and outcomes would be that they're planning to do, what local partner they're planning to work with, that type of thing, and also, of course, a detailed budget. And then there is a appraisal panel in MFAT, which considers all of the proposals, and we have a number of different criteria that we're looking at when we do that. And as that we would fund all of the proposals that we receive. In fact, often we might have a total value of proposals much greater than the envelope that we have to work with on our side. So we have to make some really tough decisions, and TC Yasa was another example of that, where we couldn't fund all of the we received. So TC Yasa is one example where we've mobilised NZDRP in the Pacific. Also, within the last 12 months, we've had rounds in both Fiji and Vanuatu following Tropical Cyclone Harold. Some of you might remember this. TC Harold impacted multiple Pacific countries in April last year, with Fiji and Vanuatu being worst affected. And so, yeah, we launched separate rounds for both of those countries after that. And we also did what was quite unique for us, which was an NZDRP looking specifically at COVID-19 to try to reduce around COVID-19 and also to deal with some of the sort of secondary impacts associated with how countries were managing the risks associated with COVID-19. So those activities are ongoing, and then, of course, TC Yasa as well. Very quickly, before talking about some of the specific challenges associated with COVID, to note that on a much smaller scale, we do also work directly with local NGOs in Pacific countries. This is normally led through the relevant High Commission, because we're not really well placed to do it from here in Wellington. So in terms of COVID-19, it has certainly changed the way that we would approach specific countries affected by natural disasters. The really obvious one is around the movement restrictions, which most Pacific countries have put in place to try to keep COVID-19 out, and very understandably so. Practically speaking, for us, the requirement to enter normally 14 days in most Pacific countries of time in a managed isolation or quarantine facility would normally sort of negate any potential benefit of sending a rapid response technical team. So whereas previously for events such as TC Winston or TC Gita in Tonga in 2018, we might have sent technical teams from across the New Zealand government system. Things like our New Zealand Medical Assistance Team, which is coordinated through the Ministry of Health. That's just not really an easily implementable option given all of the COVID-19 movement restrictions. What we've done instead, recognising these challenges, is to look to do relatively more with organisations that already have an established presence in the affected countries and have some capacity to provide either sort of humanitarian emergency response or early recovery type assistance to affected populations. And I suppose this links to the point that COVID-19, it has created, a number of sort of logistical challenges to work through, but it's also created, I think, for us, some opportunities to think a little bit differently about how we do support Pacific countries, and to look again at all of the capacity which already exists right across the region. And there's a bit of a buzzword which is talked about quite a lot in the humanitarian sphere that many people will have heard about, which is localization. So recognizing that oftentimes humanitarian responses will be improved if they're as local as possible. So, with decision making to affected populations and also the implementing being largely led by local actors, of course, with supplementation or support from international actors as much as is required. So I think COVID has really, in a way, accelerated the localization agenda, which is talked about right across the globe, but including in the Pacific. And it's stimulated, I know, some thinking for us internally in MFAT right across the aid program in terms of how we work offshore. And I know that's been mirrored in a number of our NGO partners as well in terms of, perhaps new ways of working that might last longer than the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to pause there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Richie. Let's make sure I'm on mute, not on mute. Thanks so much, Richie. And but great to hear all those key words around partnership and localization as well. If anyone does have any questions, we might field at least one or two questions, but we will wrap up very, very quickly. So if anyone does have any questions, perhaps just unmute yourself and fire away in the next minute. Yeah, certainly the timing of Yasa was a very strict reminder that many of that disasters certainly don't wait for good timing or scheduling around Christmas and New Year and holidays. And we know right at the moment there's another tropical cyclone floating around the Pacific. So touch wood or a false formica tabletop that we don't find ourselves responding again by the end of next week. But thank you, Richie, Steph, Phil, and Jamila, and thank you for everyone for joining us. And you're all a bunch of inspiring individuals, and we look forward to hopefully a relatively calm rest of cyclone season. Thanks again.
Very much, Aaron.
Aaron.
Thanks, everyone.